We can all make our way to our seats. We'll get going with our lesson this morning. This morning we're going to continue in lesson number 2 of Temperance. We started last week, so there were a few things that we didn't quite get to that we'll touch on as we get started this morning, and then kind of move into the second part of the lesson where we deal specifically with some different applications of it. So that's where we're headed this morning. There, just a little bit of housekeeping type things. There are 2 lessons left that we're going to do in this series, and then the quarter will be over. We're ending about a week early because of the VBS, and that week is actually the last week of the quarter. And on that week, Brother Tim, that's here with us, will have a class that morning. So we're going to talk about temperance this morning, and then there's 2 other lessons to round out the study, and that'll be everything that we'll be doing with it. So in your books or the material that you have, we'll do lesson 11 and lesson 12. Lesson 13 was a review, which was basically asking a question about each one of the other lessons that we did. So take a look at those for the next couple weeks, and then we'll wrap this particular study up. Let's begin this morning. Before we get started on temperance, let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll look at our lesson material together. Our gracious Father, our great God in heaven, we come before you this morning recognizing you as the one true God. We understand, Father, that no one else can do what you have done and create what you have created. We thank you, Father, for such wisdom in your design, such foresight that you have shown us in what you have made. We see in your word that you have always planned for us to be able to come to you, and you've made a way for that since the very foundation of time. We're so grateful for that. We thank you for that, Father. As we think about that way that comes through Jesus, we are constantly reminded of his denying of himself to submit to your will. We're grateful for that. We thank you for his example and for his teaching. We've asked, Father, that you would help us to be able to acknowledge the things that we see in him, not just in word and not just to have intellectual knowledge about it, but be willing to look at his example and be willing to change our daily decisions, to change our thoughts, to change our will, to be like him and to submit to you. Help us in difficult days and difficult trials to be able to appreciate that even if we cannot understand what the outcome will be, that your will is supreme, and to be able to give ourselves to that. Help us to understand how controlling ourselves in our temper and in our pride and in our decisions and our actions and reactions, and how those things will glorify you and will be something that others would be drawn to when they see us submit to you in that way. We ask for wisdom as we take some of these things into our hearts to use it in the right way. Thank you for all that you do for us and for your love that we see each day, for your care and grace and for your long suffering. Please be with those that we continue to pray and think about that need your help, who are suffering physically, who are struggling mentally, who need your tender care. Please watch over them. We ask these things this morning in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, last week we were looking at some of the things that talked about why temperance or self-control was essential. And just to catch up, we've all had a busy week, and just to kind of get our minds back into it, this word temperance is not one that we use a lot today, unless we're talking about temper or maybe our temperament about something. But it basically, as the idea, it means self-control. And though this study we've referenced self-control several times, we're looking specifically at how that element is infused in lots of different parts of our lives, and how it looks practically day to day. And so we started talking about why it's essential and where it's essential. And then today, we're going to move on. We're going to just touch on a couple we didn't get to last week, and then we're going to move on to a couple places where it's needed. And that'll be our time this morning. It's going to take the time we have to be able to just go through some of those. We won't be able to get to every one that's listed there, because I think there's hopefully a lot of good discussion that goes with it. So we left off last time just talking about this passage in Titus, about that temperance is essential in purity. And that's probably not something that we often think about, that I need self-control in the idea of being pure. But look at what it means in this sense when you read in Titus here. It says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for a blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ." So when we think about the idea of that we need self-control, or that it is essential in purity, notice what Paul writes to Titus here when he tells them, this is the kind of people that you ought to be, those who are renouncing ungodliness and worldly passions. And if you go back through the ages, it's interesting to read writings of different philosophers, or we might today call them social commentators, in how they talked about how the worldly passions or some of the lustful things of the world were affecting their society. There's a famous quote from Plato that I didn't bring with me, but he goes on for a paragraph or so talking about how the children are no longer listening to their parents, how morality has declined, and several things that as you read the paragraph, if you didn't know who wrote it, you would think it's somebody today talking about what's happening, but it wasn't. It was 2,000 years ago, same things. So this was written roughly 2,000 years ago, if we're rounding. So when you think about what Paul is writing here, renouncing ungodliness and worldly passions to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. That's very practical advice. But notice what he says before that. He says that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to do this, to renounce these things. So that's my first question. When you think about it, how do you train to be greater at self-control? If that's what's needed to be able to live godly lives, and that's what's needed to be able to then to have this idea of purity, how do you train for that? That's what I'm interested to hear what you think about it. So that's not the easy question to start with this morning. But Josh is going to take it. Go.
Well, I think contextually in Titus 2, you have older men teaching younger men. You have older women teaching younger women. So I think that's certainly a part of our training, is listening to those who have experienced some of the things we may be going through. And in hindsight, can teach us something.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful place to start to think about. If you want to be able to get yourself in the right mindset and to train self-control, the Bible tells us very clearly that's one of the first places to go. Those who have experience, those who have done these things, what do they say? How can they help? How can they advise? A couple other ones here. Kevin, and we'll work our way around.
Well, on the negative side, you wouldn't train yourself self-control by reading this and then saying, I'm saved by grace, don't bother me.
Right. Exactly. It's obvious as you read through this that there are specific things that require action.
So back to the first beatitude, poor in spirit, a sense of where yourself is compared to God.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to think about. We'll talk about that here in a little bit when we think about pride and how self-control affects us there. Steve, do you have something?
Yes, I was just going to say, in training anything, practice has to be equated in the whole situation, whatever it is.
Okay.
Physical, anything of that nature. So you're going to have to go through some trial and error.
Yeah.
You're going to have to walk through it. You're going to have to analyze it. You're going to have to, look at it and just find out, where did I go wrong? What was I doing before this all happened? Things of that nature.
Okay, I think that's a good point. Not give up at the first time you fail, right? Training is something that you do repeatedly, over and over, in order for it to become the second nature of the thing that you consistently do. So I think that's a good thing to think about as well too. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you could be in a lot of circumstances where you're not sitting in a congregation where you have older men to look to, people that you can look up to, for different things. But we all had the opportunity to go back into like work.
Sure.
You know. And
Yeah.
when I think of something like this, I think of James chapter 1.
Okay.
When it says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials at various times in that trial, for you know that the testing of your faith now is going to produce steadfastness.
Yeah.
Which is you can increase yourself by going to God's Word and knowing what to do, and
Right. And so think of some of the things that we're hearing here, thinking about, those who have experience, that those can help with us, being consistent about it, realizing there's going to be failures, trials are going to help us be strengthened through those things. So, start putting all of this together and you kind of see where this is going. Dodd, then Alan. Go ahead.
I think it's important to surround yourself with people who are doing what you're aspiring to do. So exercise, sports, same thing. Any attributes you're trying to pick up, you want to learn from people who are doing it, and it'll also force you to keep yourself in check.
Right. Kind of the accountability idea, right?
Yeah, and so let me just go back to other verses too. A little leaven leavens the whole bunch, and it's the other way around too.
Yeah.
If you want to train yourself, don't try and do it on your own.
Okay. I think that's good advice. Alan, did you have something?
Yeah, these are all good suggestions. But I think it still goes back to what you think all the time, what your thoughts are.
Sure.
Are they Christian? Are they for God?
Okay, yeah. Ultimately...
That day, that way, after we get up in the morning. Now that's hard to do with our lives that we live. Maybe we don't know strong enough. We'll find out in judgment.
All right, and so I'll add, a couple of my thoughts in with that and kind of put it all together here. So we've had a lot of great discussion with it. On top of that, how you start each day is gonna have to do with it. I think that's a good point. So do you start each day with the Word of God, or do you start hitting the ground confused, concerned, worked up about what it is that needs done that's in front of you? And so that's one of the things that I think if you want to train yourself in self-control, you have to start each day the right way. I'm guilty of not doing that, so I think all of us can do better at that. And that's one thing to think about when you want to appreciate where this is going to go and how this is going to help. A couple more and then we'll move on. Merritt?
Think of training, you're seeking to achieve something, but training is an incremental process.
Yes.
You take up powerlifting. To Joshua's point, you hope you're around people when you start that can say, this is the proper form, this is how you start, so that when you want to build discipline in the small things first,
Right.
or you'll never make it to your goal. Yeah. It's very, be faithful in the little things first. Just, what did I do when I woke up? Am I able to not eat that or do that? It's just the little things first before you become that mature man or woman that you're seeking to be.
Yeah, that's how you grow and how you build on things. Yeah, Chris, you have something?
You say patience with yourself.
Okay.
That's one thing we talk about, being patient with others, which is very important, but sometimes we have to be patient with ourselves too. We can get frustrated with ourselves, and I can't believe I did that, and I can't believe I didn't do that. And then sometimes when you don't have a good attitude with yourself, then it makes it hard for you to actually do better later. You have to be patient, like, okay, yes, I'm not going to get it right away, I'm going to fail a couple of times, but I'll get there eventually, and just got to keep trying.
Okay, yeah, that in and of itself is some self-control there of your mindset. Not running away with the thoughts of I can't do this or I can't complete this. So lots of great things. And there's more we could probably talk about with it. But let's, understand that the idea of temperance affects and is essential in so many different parts of life. Last one that we didn't get to last time was talking about in having a happy marriage, that self-control is necessary. And that may not be the first thing that we think of when we're talking about marriage, but understand what it is that helps with that. And he went on in a paragraph here to talk about it, had to have harmony in the home, and that those who lack self-control are going to have issues with that. And he makes a comment here that I've heard him say before, and Mark 8, the writer does, that he came across a book that talked about various marriage problems, and at the bottom of each page, I think is the way he put it, or on every page, the solution to it, besides some advice that was given, the first solution was Mark 8:34, which is the one that we looked at the beginning of this class, which says, that everyone who wants to follow after Jesus needs to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow him. And he talks about that's the first answer in marriage difficulties, is for each person to be able to do that, to deny themselves. And so when you think about, how does self-control bring happiness in marriage? Any quick thoughts on that? Yeah, Josh?
Bring financial happiness, control your spending. Obviously, it's going to bring happiness with regards to sexual purity.
Okay. Yeah.
You need to be self-controlled and be loyal and devoted to your spouse. Just anger issues.
Okay. Yeah.
Your self-control is going to bring happiness to your marriage if you're not fighting and verbally and physically abusive.
Yep.
It's a laundry list of things.
You're right. You can look at several different parts of the relationship and how that comes to play. And here's what I did. I put this verse on here because it speaks to both parties in the marriage. When I'm talking about self-control, we'll just sum it up here, since this isn't a marriage class. It says, he's talking about husbands at the first of it, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and for the wife, see that she respects her husband. If both people are willing to do that in the marriage, that takes self-control, doesn't it? To love the other as yourself. To be self-controlled in the fact that you're willing to control, everything else that you're going to do, the passions that you may have, the things that you're going to that you want to do for yourself, to do that for the other person. That takes control, doesn't it? And on the other side as well, the wife respecting her husband and taking care of him in the way that of what the Bible means, about that. And again, we don't have time to go into all of that, but those things show us how both people have a part in that relationship and how self-control helps it to be something that's peaceful. Ruby, go ahead.
One of the things that I experienced years ago, that when you're having a conversation, talking about something they like or don't like, this whole big point. If they start yelling at each other or keep talking to each other, that they're not listening to the other person in the argument. They have the self-control to just shut what they say. And then you can say, it's my turn. This is my turn. And if we have both sides, then that works out. But if you have to have the self-control to shut your mouth.
Yeah. In case you guys didn't hear that, I think that's good advice. I'm going to repeat it because it didn't come from me. It came from somebody more experienced than me. The idea of, being able to stop talking, to shut your mouth, and to listen to what the other person is saying. I'm just going to add to it that, you stop talking, have self-control to stop talking, and listen to what they're saying instead of just waiting to respond. Sometimes that's what happens, is we're just waiting to respond and not really listening. So a lot of self-control goes into that, to be able to do that. And it's a hard thing to do sometimes, isn't it? A couple quick ones. Yeah, Alan?
What do you think about removing the TVs?
Removing TVs can't hurt. That's what I think. Hard to do in today's day, because it's become an integral part of our culture. In fact, we've moved beyond TVs. You don't need the TV anymore. You have devices. I have one on me. There's one right here. There's one behind us. Those are everywhere. So those can distract from focusing on one another, and it takes self-control to turn those off. Put down the phone, say, hey, you know what? When I get home, I'm turning this off. I'm not going to turn it back on until tomorrow. We're not going to turn the TV on tonight. We're going to focus on something else. Yeah, that's self-control. That's hard, but that's beneficial to a relationship, isn't it? Very good. Well, in just moving through some of the other things, the other thoughts that we see in the other part of this lesson, he talks about where it's needed. And some of these we've touched on in what we've already discussed. So let's just think about a few of them together here in the time we have left. Talking about self-control, where temperance needed in our temper. And these couple of verses I like here in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 17. A man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. And the Proverbs 16:32, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. You think about that for a minute. When we look at those who are in positions of authority, you think about a governor or a mayor or a president who's in charge of lots of different things, and you think about sometimes what it takes to be that kind of person, to be a leader of that capacity, especially depending on the size of the city or what it is that you're ruling over. It takes a lot of things to be able to hold that together, doesn't it? And we look at people who are able to do that with some respect. The proverb writer says, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Whoever can control his spirit is better than the one who even has the wherewithal to rule a city. And I think that was interesting to look at. Proverbs 25 and 28, which I didn't put up there, was in the lesson, talks about a man without self-control is like a city broken and left without walls. So someone who has lost their self-control, someone who is just open and ripe for anything to happen. So that's interesting when you consider it. So why do you think temper is so hard to control? Talking about self-control, and some things are easier than others, I would say. Why is temper so hard? What do you think? Yes, Seth?
Well, back to all the other thoughts, if you don't work on it, you can't control it.
Okay. Yep. And so if we don't think we don't have a problem, first of all, then that's going to be part of it if we're not going to work on it. Jake?
Psychologically, when we get angry, we release something in our brain that inhibits the typical frontal lobe action that's supposed to happen. That's our decision making, our impulse control, all that stuff. It starts inhibiting that. So for whatever that's worth, there's just an actual reaction in our brain that when we get worked up and angry, that we put ourselves in a place where it's hard for us to think about right and wrong. It's hard for us to control our actions. Not that we can, it just makes it a lot harder. So maybe we should try just not being angry in the first place. Yeah. But it still requires much. That's why I think it is so mighty, so great a deed when you can get to that point, because no matter what your brain is actually doing, you are still able to control it.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. There's a study. I don't have all the details, and we don't have time to go into it, but the quick overview is the study was, and I don't remember the name of the part of the brain. Some of you medical people can help me out. But there's about a 5-second delay between when this initial part of the brain engages and the neocortex engages. The neocortex is what's going to help you think and reason through things, like Jake was talking about. I think it's, I'm not going to say it because I'm going to say it wrong. It starts with an A. I'll put it that way. It's the tiny part of the brain that is your initial reaction. If somebody comes up and smacks you in the face and your first reaction is to smack them right back, somebody comes up and is going to punch you and your reaction is to do this, or somebody cuts you off on the road and your first reaction is to make a gesture, to yell something, there's that 5-second delay. And that's when this little part of the brain engages immediately. Evolutionists will tell you it's your fight or flight response versus the neocortex. So there's an actual physiological thing that involves our temper that we need to recognize, first of all. And as Jake said, if you can recognize that and learn to control that, you've taken a step ahead of a lot of people. And the Bible points out that, the man who's able to do that is headed in the right direction as far as God's concerned. Quick comments? Yeah, Chris?
It kind of fall in line with what Ruby said a little bit ago about us wanting to get our way and not taking a step back and listening to the other side. Sure. We don't always know why someone cut us off. A lot of times they had no right. But every once in a while it could be there was a reason why they did it. That's right. We don't always know that, and we need to try to think of other perspectives instead of always want to get our way.
Yes, we'll use the driving example, and that's something that I wrestle with, and my very optimistic daughter, I won't tell you which one, said to me, "You never know, Dad, maybe they're on their way to the hospital." So, you don't know sometimes, right? Right, Alan?
Yeah, why that 5 seconds? That's why I say 10 seconds. When you get older, it
takes a little longer, yeah. Good things to. So, develop self-control while you're young, so you can span that extra 5 seconds, right? Right? Good point, Rich.
There's also the need to put it into perspective.
Sure.
There's always those people out there that are trying to push your buttons.
Yeah, that's true.
And
that's true.
It's when you keep God's will in there, and it's hard. For me, it's probably twice as hard as anybody else, but I have that's the one thing that I have a little sign on my desk, it's not important.
There you go.
And the thing is, people will tell you, it's got to be done now. This is so pressing, or I'm going to do this to you if you don't do this, or all these certain things. Well, you're in trouble for this or that. Nobody can do anything to you. God's the only one that can really do anything to you that matters.
Right. If you have control of yourself, control of your mind, you recognize that. One thing that you said, people try to push your buttons. Yes, there's external circumstances, and sometimes people purposefully try to get you to lose your temper, right? And think about the verse, I guess I forgot, it's not up there, 25:28, Proverbs 25:28. The man without self-control is like a city broken and left without walls. If you let somebody push your buttons, you have just opened yourself up to no protection, right? But if you have self-control, you're keeping that stuff out. And you're able to focus on what you need to focus on. Important to think about. Let's move through a couple other ones here. Needed in our pride. Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, he says, "For by grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith God has assigned him." So, how we think about ourselves. We don't often put self-control into that realm sometimes, but we need to. Is it wrong to be proud of things or to be proud of yourself in certain ways? Oh, nobody wants to answer that one. Oh, wow, all at once. Cheryl?
Well, sometimes I think you can have a low self-esteem of yourself so much that can cause.
Yep, that's true. I agree. Yeah. So thinking about that, Merritt, what were you going to say?
Just, it's okay to feel excited or joyful over things, but just always to remember that by the grace of God or by the blessings of God that allowed these things to you. And most of those things that we bask in are physical, not so much the spiritual.
Right.
Even to let that kind of reign supreme in our mind is important.
Yep. And that's where I think, I'm moving faster now because the time is ticking away. The second question, how does self-control keep us from crossing the line into sinful behavior with pride? Well, what Merritt said, I think, is a good way to look at that. That we're keeping in mind that we're doing things for the glory of God. We're thinking about what's important. And that our accomplishments, the things that we're able to accomplish, most times are because of abilities He's given us or because He's allowed us to do something. So keeping that in mind, I think, is one way to keep that in check. Rich, do you have something real quick?
Yeah, the only thing I was saying was having a measure of pride is basically, if you promise somebody something, do that. Be proud that you're able to keep your word and do that. Some people, they'll promise you the world and they have no problem just blowing it off and it doesn't matter. Just doing a good job. It's almost like, Martin Luther King's the street sweeper. That whole thing, do the job as if you're doing it for Jesus Himself. And try to be like that, but do it not just to puff yourself up and be seen of men, but just do it just because God has seen fit to give you that talent. We'll use it.
That's right. That's the best attitude that you can have with it, is to understand that the talents, the abilities, the accomplishments, whatever it is, whatever words you want to put in there that we have, come from things that God has done for us. And if we recognize things that way, go back to meekness that we talked about for several weeks, then yes, we can be good at something. We can have strength under control in things. We can accomplish much for the work of the kingdom. Where we start to get out of accomplishing much for God is when we start to think, as Paul says, of ourselves more highly than we ought to think, instead of remembering that what we're doing is for His glory and for His purpose. I think that's a good way to look at it. I skipped the one about our words in the lesson because it talks about James 3 and controlling our tongue, and Josh did a great job covering that when we studied James 3, and we talked about the things that go along with that and how we need to be controlled in that way. What about our thoughts, though? That's one of the next ones that he talks about here, that we need to control our thoughts. 2 Corinthians 10:5, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Paul's talking about something else here in context, but the principle is here at the end of that, where he says, and take every thought into captive to obey Christ. So, thinking about you and I now. we understand about we need to be self-controlled in what we say, and maybe in our pride, as we talked about, or in some of the things that we're doing, and how to train for that. We've discussed that. But what about the thought thing? Here's another one in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22, where Paul says, "Flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace among those who call on the Lord from a pure heart." So this is the idea of what we think and being able to have that under control. So, which is harder to control, what you say or what you think? Or are they the same? I don't know. Yeah.
I'm going to say they're both equally the same. I just went through an experience this week, and I got a text which made me want to automatically respond, because I can respond, okay?
Sure.
And so I was typing so fast, I'm like, I didn't know I could text that fast. I was texting my response. And when I got to a point, I stopped. And I'm like, no, you're not going to do this. So I immediately erased it and didn't respond. However, it stayed on my mind that day, that night, the next day, the next night. And so by the next afternoon, I had to go into prayer and ask the Lord to remove that from my mind.
Right.
Because it's so heavy, so your thoughts can destroy your body as well. But the Lord did that, and He does things. I love the way He works. I asked Him one afternoon, and before I knew it, it wasn't even a day and a half. I wasn't thinking about it. And last night I was cleaning off my desk, and I had written down some stuff. And it was only when I looked at what I had written down that I realized that He had removed that from my thoughts.
Sure. So you see the idea of prayer and taking things to God, laying burdens on Him, and focusing on the right things is what helps us deal with those different situations. Any other thoughts? Easier to control what you say or think. Seth?
Go back to the response in the car if somebody cuts you off. You yell it out or gesture, you can stop that maybe, but then you still think it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Elaine?
One verse that I think about a lot when I think about my thoughts is 2 Peter 2:19, where it talks about people promising freedom, say whatever you want, do whatever you want, but whatever you're overcome by, that's what you're a slave to.
Okay.
And I think about my heart and my thoughts are overcome by worrying about what other people think of me, anger, that kind of thing. That's what's enslaving me and not Christ.
That's right. So let's kind of just say, if we bundle this one up a little bit, sometimes it is easier. We think it's easier to control what we say than what we think. But I encourage you to go back and don't treat the symptom, treat the problem. It starts with what's in our heart. It starts if we're willing to be self-controlled people, because what we put into our heart and the kind of people that we are and what kind of heart we have is going to determine then what we think. And then what we think is going to control what we say. What we say controls what we do. What we do forms habits, and those habits become our character. You've heard me say this before. It's a chain, right? So self-control at its core in our thoughts keep us from saying, then doing, then becoming things that are not glorifying to God. And that's what we want to remember. The last one I had on the screen was reactions. There's a few more in the lesson for you to look at. It talks about Christ, that when He was reviled, did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. And just, there's a question to think about. We're out of time now, but how would you advise someone to learn to control their reactions? I'll submit to you that has to do with what we just said. Starts at the heart. Starts at when you're willing to control yourself and your thoughts, and goes from there. So thanks for your participation today. Great class. Lesson 11 for next week, please. Thank you.